morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this pale blue dot that we all live on. My name is Adam-Antium, you're the audience, and welcome to the January 5th, 2015 edition of AAU TZM Podcasts. And just the usual announcement for those of you listening to this on YouTube right now, my podcast also exists on talkshoe.com. Down below in the video description you'll find the link to the call series. There you can listen to and download the full MP3 files completely for free. That way you don't have to listen to 30-minute videos on YouTube if you don't want to. The usual plug as well is for those of you who want to actually know exactly what the Zeitgeist Movement advocates, then if you go to www.thezeitgeistmovement.com/orientation, and there you can get hold of essentially the orientation guide that we've created, called the Zeitgeist Movement Defined. If you want a hard copy of it, then you can order it for a very low price at both, I think it's Amazon.com and Lulu.com. But if you just want to have a PDF of it, you can download it completely for free, just like I did. But I've also got a physical copy as well that I bought from a Z-Day event for like £5. But yeah, there's that. If you want to know exactly what it is that we advocate, then that is a complete guide to the train of thought itself. Other announcements, due to more computer problems, Chapter 3 Threshold, my third and final short film, has been a little bit further delayed. Once I get a new computer, then I'll be, on speed to finishing it, but, a planned obsolescence again. But anyway, that aside, just so for those of you who are in the know, then this podcast is actually today celebrating its 5th birthday. The 5th of January 2010 was the first ever episode that I did, and it's been going every single month without fail for 5 years now, so very pleased about that. But I mean, that's just a thing that just shows that I've got the persistence enough to do my bit to change the world and create this media. But anyway, it is my unfortunate task, however, to inform you that Quote Minecraft is now no longer our sponsor, since they were actually the victim of a directed cyber attack, would you believe? Unfortunately, as it turns out, this is obviously not an important company, so they weren't featured on the news and thus never saved by the establishment. Turns out that what actually happened was there was a feminist group that used Quote Minecraft to go after a pickup artist to demonize him into seeming to advocate and practice sexual assault on women in bars. But said video was debunked, and a counter-reaction was actually in the form of a men's rights activist group mounting the cyber attack itself. So yeah, no more Quote Minecraft, and yet again I need to get a new sponsor. But, I always find a new one. So, this podcast is brought to you by Busy Bees, a new drone courier firm. Following the success of Amazon's drone delivery concept, this new company emerged as the industry leader and now sponsors this show. You can recognise their drones because they actually look like pixelated bees, kind of like what you see in early 90s video game graphics. Pretty distinctive. So if you go to www.busybeescourier.com for more information on that, click on the microphone link and enter the code name, and this is all one word in capital letters, NWO, the number 4, the win. Enter that code name and you'll get 10% off all deliveries to you. This podcast is also brought to you by my entrusted triad of sponsorship, providing the points of preservation that keeps this podcast show afloat and coming to you free every single month without fail. My triad consists at the moment of Russell Brand, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas, and Sir Patrick Stewart. Now, they've all agreed to co-fund this podcast until they can spare at least 10 minutes to come onto the show to talk with me about science and sustainability when applied to society. that being the ultimate fulfillment of their role as a member of the Triada sponsorship. They're free to go, and their role is then filled by a new contributor. So it's sort of like a revolving door sort of thing, like a rotation. So cheers very much, guys, for your sponsorship so far. So, ladies and gents, be sure to message, tweet, text, email, smoke signal, whatever you got to do to thank these individuals for sponsoring this show. The more we thank them, the more likely they will be to actually come onto the show and have this chat. But just a personal announcement, ladies and gents. If I do ramble a little bit, or if my voice sounds a bit out, I have, my father gave me the flu for Christmas, so I have been recouping. But that said, with a greater degree of tragedy in mind, I was actually going to be doing a film review of the film Hotel Rwanda, which stars Don Cheadle. However, I realised that I didn't have enough time to do enough research on this issue, because this film is based on a true story. It was based on a true story, but I realised that the film only tells a small part of the overall story, and I wouldn't be doing justice to the people who were killed to actually do a proper podcast on it. I needed more time to do research, and I was running up against the deadline, and so instead I chose to do a review of a film that I've been meaning to do for a while, which, as you can tell by the title, I'm going to be reviewing Total Recall, the 2012 version of it, not the 1990 original film starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, even though both Total Recall itself, both incarnations, they were actually based on a short story. I think it was by Philip K. Dick, I think his name was, and it was a short story called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, something like that. But this is the 2012 version starring Colin Farrell that I'm going to be reviewing. So yeah, just bear with me. I'm having to take sips of water to keep my throat working. And it is in the wee hours, so I do need to keep it down a little bit. Anyway, basically the premise for this film, it doesn't completely follow the 1990 version where it does the whole secret agent thing on Mars, but instead it does it on Earth, but in the future. Basically the premise of it is that in about 80 to 90 years, global chemical warfare has basically rendered the vast majority of the planet uninhabitable, and there's only 2 livable zones left, and they're known as territories, and one of them is basically the British Isles and a little bit of Western Europe, and that's known as the United Federation of Britain, or the UFB, and the other livable area is Australia, and that's basically called the colony. And basically the colony is where all the working class people work, and it's severely overpopulation is a real problem there, because essentially it's like an exaggerated futuristic version of Rio de Janeiro, where all the dwellings are almost stacked on top of each other going up the hill, but there's suspension platforms where there's entire housing blocks that are suspended in midair, which comes in as an interesting dynamic for the chases later on, because the action sequences in this film are top notch. And just as I'm, getting into this, this review will contain spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film or don't know anything about it and you don't want it spoiled for you, then click away from this podcast. Watch the film first. It's the 2012 version of Total Recall. Have a watch of it first, and then come back to the review. But anyway, carrying on. Because the excuse me. Because the working class need a place place to actually work, besides in the overcrowded colony itself, the transport system that they have to use, because most of the planet's uninhabitable, they have to basically tunnel through the planet. And it's interesting, it's basically in this like huge metallic elevator that's like, you know, basically a tower block as an elevator. But yeah, they travel on that. That's called the fall, because basically the elevator just falls under the weight of gravity through the planet, and as it passes the core, obviously you're moving away from the centre of the planet's mass, so gravity's working against you, and it slows it down to the point of it, you know, clamping on the other side. So that's basically how they travel through the planet, and that's an interesting thing. I hadn't actually seen anything like that in a film before, which is quite cool. But anyway, the film opens. That's basically the premise of it. The UFB, or the United Federation of Britain, is a more affluent, sort of like elite, not necessarily elite class, but I don't think there's any poverty in the UFB. There's a hell of a lot of poverty in the colony, though. But that being said, it opens with a dream sequence. We're introduced to the Douglas Quaid character that's being chased out of this facility, and he's with this woman. And obviously, there's a tragedy towards the end of the dream. He wakes up, and supposedly in the real world, lying next to his wife Laurie, and supposedly this is a recurring dream that he's been having. But yeah, Doug essentially works in the synthetic police droid factory, because, you know, in both the colony and in the UFB, there's these sort of like droid policemen, as it were. Quite cool. And basically he works, you know, on the assembly line, putting them together, which is ironic, because that means that the workers of the colony are building their own system of enslavement, which is an interesting dynamic. You know, it's kind of like, I think it was a Doug Stanhope joke that said, because I think it's in his show, before turning the gun on himself, he equates Western society with a group of prisoners whose job in the prison is to make keys for their own cell door. You know, but in this instance, it's people creating their own enslavement. But yeah, that's basically where Doug works, and his wife Laurie supposedly works as a paramedic. Just as they're about to get jiggy, she gets called out on an emergency that's supposed to be like a train bombing, and then we see on the news that it was actually a train bombing upon the UFB, supposedly at the hands of Matthias's resistance movement. And it's here where we're introduced to quite an interesting dynamic, which is Matthias's slogan, that being "the fall enslaves us all." Now, this, in a sense, it represents the struggle against the elitist, affluent UFB and the underclass of the colony, which serves as the world's workforce, basically. And even though, you know, the people in the colony are given their own place to live, it's essentially a big scraggle of slum towns, really. But there are some, you know, thriving industries, like, for example, Recall, which we'll get to later on. But yeah, essentially, it's always the fall itself, the elevator itself, that is taking the people from the colony through the planet to the UFB, where they're working as slaves, essentially. And I can understand that. I mean, obviously, you know, the people in the colony would want a higher standard of living, but it's the general public themselves aren't rising up as much. There's a small resistance movement, but there's no there's no massive civil unrest. Most people seem to have accepted their slavery for the most part, which is, quite disheartening. But then again, this is like the late 21st century, and things are very bleak. So then again, that could be even more of an excuse to actually get up and do something. But anyway, but yeah, essentially in response to the attack, Cohaagen, the main antagonist of the film, he's the Chancellor of the United Federation of Britain, or the UFB. He announces on the media that the UFB will be cutting off humanitarian aid to the colony and concentrating on the production of the synthetic police droids. All of this, obviously, when it's portrayed in the media, it's portrayed as something that needs to be done because the resistance are getting out of control and threatening people's lives, and they're spreading terror, right? So we need to get more. We need to have more police. Therefore, feel much safer. Obviously, this is a pretext, which we'll get into later on. But yeah, I mean, coming back to Doug, despite Harry, Harry's one of basically Doug's best friend and work colleague that he hangs around with all the time. Despite Harry's words of discouragement, Doug is drawn to the idea of going to Recall, a memory implantation clinic. And it's clear at this point that Doug is unsatisfied and jaded with his life, but has no real external reinforcement for it. I mean, all the forces in his life are keeping him where he is, which isn't the worst life he could have given the socioeconomic climate, but, there's always... excuse me. But always tugging at his subconscious is the yearning for something greater, something more exciting. In this sense, Doug represents essentially the working class hero, the underdog, the plucky underdog, the slum dog, as it were, who happened to strike lucky with marrying a pretty paramedic and works at a droid factory, but most people's lives aren't any more spectacular than that, if you think about it. And he's always like yearning for something better, and even like he hangs out with Harry at a bar and says, is this all you wanted your life to amount to? Is this it? Is this life? And and if you think about it, these are the seeds of positive social change for a lot of people. People realise that they're living a life where they're not able to really enjoy living. They're not able to enjoy the time they have. They're constantly stressed. They're constantly under all kinds of pressures and responsibilities, and all this stuff. And especially if there's something in this kind of world, which is essentially a post-apocalyptic world, a post-chemical warfare world where most of the planet has become unlivable. So there's even less of a standard of living. Even if you live in the UFB, there's still some limitations. But no, he represents the working class hero who realizes that there needs to be more from life. Obviously, in Doug's case, there's a different reason why he's saying all these things, because as we'll find out later on, he has actually done these things. But after a few rounds at a bar, Doug decides to go to Recall anyway, and you can tell that if you watch the conversation between Doug and Harry, and the kind of cynicism that Harry comes out with, it's the kind of cynicism that I encounter all the time. It's people who are completely happy with their life, regardless of how shit it is. You know, those kind of people. But anyway, and sometimes I think to myself whether Harry is actually being like that because he truly has accepted his life, or whether he's actually been deliberately put in place to watch over him and discourage any kinds of, dare I say, quote unquote, revolutionary thinking or action. Don't look outside your remit. Don't look outside your life for inspiration on what you want your life to be about. Just accept things. I'm happy. You should be too. Go home. But it's interesting how, because I think it was, because in the 1990 film, the Harry character was actually clearly put there, in place as an intelligence operative to look over him, or at least maybe if it was his friend beforehand, then he was basically approached and forced to say, look, he's had his memory erased, do this, watch over him, don't let him get out of line. But this film is a bit more ambiguous about that. There's more of a sort of thing where Harry is just like, yeah, I'm happy with my life, But just as a side note, on Doug's way to recall, yes, this film does also feature the triple-breasted prostitute, but I think this version actually did it much more tastefully, so yeah, there's that. Excuse me. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to edit out all these coughs like I used to. I want you to appreciate how I'm feeling, man. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, the recall clinic, going back to recall, the recall clinic itself, it has an undeniably oriental decor. There's almost the implication that the clinic itself is operating behind the scenes of a Japanese massage parlour. The kind of feel that those kind of places have. It's very calm, very serene, and everything looks like it's under control. They know what they're doing, sort of thing. There's that sort of feel to a memory implantation clinic, and there's these weird things where the tattoos that they have like this glow in the dark ink. Really, really cool. But here, it's a far cry from the corporate sort of feel of the 1990 film Recall. But anyway, here we meet McLean, who explains the process and even has a brief conversation about the nature of reality and memory. But there was one aspect of this in particular that I thought was clever, was the need to know if he had a mistress, since it would endanger the brain to have conflicting memories, and that's why people were supposedly becoming lobotomized by this recall process. The alarms were triggered, however, it was actually because he was in fact a spy, and thus causing conflict with the spy memory he was about to receive, even though at best only a little of the fluid itself entered his arm before they yanked the needle out. Was that enough to take effect? I don't know. But yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting, that if you ask for a memory or something, it can't by itself be real. But at this point, the federal police stormed the clinic. How did they know to target recall? I don't know. Maybe Doug actually has, maybe his phone was tracking him since recall. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, because the implication is that his phone comes online later on and it starts ringing. But whether they were tracking Doug to recall, I don't know. Whether it was there's no explanation for why the federal police were already there. But they certainly weren't welcome, since Mac immediately opens fire on them. So Doug is about to be arrested, and then he suddenly, when you see this like change in his facial expression, because he's like, in the foreground there's a close-up of his face, and he's putting his hand up behind his head for them to cuff him and take him away. Why they were going to arrest him, I'm not entirely sure. It's not exactly, recall is being advertised all over the colony, so it's not like it's an illegal service. It is a legal service, because otherwise, they would be like, oh right, there's recall, they're breaking the law, so let's go find them. It looked like it was a thriving place, so it looked like what they were doing was legal. It's just unclear why the federal police were there. But as I said, there's like a sudden and subtle change in his physiology, and suddenly it turns out he immediately just remembers his tactical combat training and takes out the entire team. He sets up explosives to make an exit and escapes through the streets. Meanwhile, back at the Quaid household, Laurie is worried sick because she's watching the news. A report of another terrorist attack where a lone gunman takes down 20 police, when in reality it was, I think it was 8. Apologies if I miscounted the bodies. When Doug gets home, he fesses up to Laurie, upon which she suddenly goes psycho bitch on him. Now, I don't know whether this is just because that's Laurie's real personality as a UFB undercover intelligence operative, but she's gone from loving wife to sworn enemy, and one that can kill very easily. One thing that is a bit silly here, though, is the fact that in neither film incarnations of this story is Laurie aware of Doug's true identity. I know he was a spy, but so was she, so she should know that she's just spent 6 weeks on an assignment to play the wife of a man whose memory was erased and replaced with Douglas Quaid. It was intelligence negligence on Cohagen's part, really. So what we see is Laurie simply trying to apprehend a man who has just confessed to killing the federal officers, and as such the terrorist that the news was talking about. So his true identity is unknown to her, and frankly it's a separate issue. But what is silly about it, though, is that if she knew who he was, then she would have been more prepared to actually apprehend him, which she wasn't. She wasn't prepared for the fact that he had tactical training as well. So he got away. But it's at this point that Doug's phone basically is sort of like a couple of nodes implanted into his hand, begins ringing, and we're introduced to the character of Hammond, one of his friends from Federal Intelligence, apparently. So he informs Doug that about a safe deposit box, and that he needs to remove the phone, which he does by gouging a slit in his hand and pulling it out. Now, I would say that it might be equal to the flinch factor of the 1990 version, which saw Arnold Schwarzenegger painfully pulling what looked like a ping pong ball out of his nostril, but it's still effective. Doug sells it to a teenager and gets away. A teenager, by the way, who supposedly knows his rights. And this is quite interesting, because I can imagine if I was in the world of Total Recall, and if I was based, because I think he's probably in his mid-20s, so a bit younger than me. But that's essentially who I'd be. I'd be the one saying, I know my rights.